A casual browse of Google Trends shows public interest in witches has remained pretty steady for the past 5 years, with fairly obvious peaks around Halloween every year. But witches don't have to remain something you encounter in fancy dress or as part of an Instagram hashtag. If you venture to Wookey Hole in Somerset, you can encounter a witch face to face. You won't have to worry about your safety either. After all, this witch was apparently petrified by a monk many years ago. There's even a stalagmite that looks like a stereotypical witch in profile, which, if you believe the legend, is the witch in question. Now, the River Axe created the Wookey Hole caves over millions of years ago, and it's also been a site of human occupation since the Stone Age. So how exactly did the legend of the witch become tied with the caves, and is there any truth in the story? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I hope that you're well, and I hope that the beginning of June has been a good one for you. As you might have been able to tell by my voice both in the intro and now, I'm still not 100%. I am now finally testing negative, so on paper I don't have COVID anymore, but now I'm dealing with all that fun after-infection nonsense, so yay! And that included a migraine this morning, so that wasn't particularly fun. But I am committed to bringing you this podcast anyway. I've basically been working on the blog post that this podcast episode is for, kind of off and on for about a week and a half now, so that's dedication for you. And if anybody wants to say thank you for the hard work I've put in while I haven't been well, please do feel free to either share this episode or buy me a coffee if your budget stretches to that, and that would make me very happy indeed. But anyway, this month we are moving on to a new theme. And it is the third one, basically, that people chose in the 3-way poll that I ran back in like March or something. And this is witches. And I did say at the end of the last week's episode that I'm not going to cover things like Pendle witches and so on, because I think that they've been covered really well elsewhere. But then as I started deciding which witches I was going to use this month, I've kind of ended up coming up with a bit of a theme anyway. So we're going to be looking at witches that have sort of particular legends, but that we're not entirely sure what the truth of them is. I am going to be doing real life witches like Isabel Gowdy and so on later on in the year, possibly around about Halloween. But for this month, we're going to be looking at these kind of legendary witches. And we're starting off with one of my personal favourites, which is the Witch of Wookey Hole, which is in Somerset. There's different versions of the legend, as there always is for these things, which kind of is a bit of a clue that there may not necessarily be any reality at the bottom of it, but there we go. But the main version of this particular legend claims that a witch lived in the caves. And you can actually get into the first 3, and I think it's the ones after that which are submerged, and you'd only be able to get into them if you were in the cave and stuff like that, which I just, no, not for me, thanks. And the Wookey Hole website reckons that she actually lived in the caves 1,000 years ago, and she apparently lived there with a goat and its kid, and they were her familiars. Now, in earlier years, it seemed that she'd been crossed in love, and she developed an all-consuming hatred of happy couples, and she therefore cast curses on the villagers of Wookey from her home in the caves. Obviously, people got sick of this after a while, and appealed to the abbot of Glastonbury. Surely he could rid them of the witch. Well, the abbot sent a monk to the caves, and the witch threw spell after spell at the monk, but she simply couldn't penetrate his air of goodness. And he sprinkled her with holy water as she tried to leave the caves, and then she turned to stone. And this explains why one of the rock formations in the first chamber is known as the Witch. Now, I remember when I went as a child, a tour guide pointed out a small misshapen stalagmite on the floor near the witch, explaining that it was her dog, forever petrified at her feet. And I found that desperately sad and actually said sorry as we passed. And apparently bones are once found on the cave floor around the dog, and some people think that people might have brought the dog bones in the past to try and appease the witch. Now, in one version of the story, it's actually a man from nearby Glastonbury who's gotten engaged to a young woman from Wookey. And the witch, having been jilted in the past, cursed the romance and it fell apart. And the man became a monk and stalked the witch, seeking revenge. And it was him that blessed one of the rivers in the cave and sprinkled it around the cave, splashing the witch who hid in the shadows, and she turned to stone where she stood. And in yet another version of the legend, the abbot of Glastonbury appointed Father Bernard to exorcise the witch, so at this point the monk actually gets a name. Now, by all accounts, Father Bernard apparently had much experience in such matters. Some stories claim that she was just an old woman who lived in a cave, blamed for everything that went wrong by the locals, but others say that she was a witch who tormented the villagers. And they did battle in the cave, but ultimately Father Bernard's divine authority won the day, and the witch was petrified in the cave. Now, in some versions of the story, he did this with Latin invocations alone, and then in others he threw blessed water over her, and I can't help thinking that one looks a little bit more cinematic. So how old actually is this story then? Because they're the basic versions that we do encounter. Well, the Witch of Wookey Hole was first mentioned in 1480, although some sources also say 1470, by William of Worcester. And according to him, there was actually a rock at the entrance of the caves that was called the Porter, and you needed to ask the porter for permission to enter the Hall of Wookey. And he also noted a well in an inner cave that no one could tell how deep it was, and this was believed at the time to be a holy well. Now, the witch wasn't always described as one, because Worcester talked about a stalagmite in the cave's first chamber, which does indeed sound like this particular one that we now call the witch. And to Worcester, this represented a woman spinning with a drop spindle, and there was no mention of her being a witch. Thomas Scott Holmes, in the History of the Parish and Manor of Wookey, traces the legend to 1612, although that's only a passing reference to it. And also, while it's nothing to do with the legend, I do just want to mention the name because this is absolutely brilliant. And it's one theory proposes that Wookey actually comes from the Celtic word for cave, Ogoth, because it was originally called Oggy Cave, and hole is apparently an Anglo-Saxon term for cave, so following this logic, Wookey Hole Cave means cave, 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 and I just thought that was fantastic. But anyway, back to the witch. We do have to move into the 18th century to find the real fixation on the legend, and Dr. Henry Harrington wrote the poem The Witch of Wookey in 1748, which was published in 1756. Now, Harrington describes her as being a hag so ugly she couldn't get a lover, and he apparently took his inspiration from the local legend. And as the poem runs, and I quote, "Her haggard face was foul to see, her mouth unmeet a mouth to be, her eyne of deadly leer, she naught devised but neighbours ill, and wreaked on all her wayward will, and marred all goodly cheer. All in her prime have poets sung, no gaudy youth gallant and young, ere blessed her longing arms, and hence arose her spite to vex, and blast the youth of either sex by dint of hellish charms." So in this poem, she's basically turned to stone by a learned wight sent from Glastonbury to deal with her, and the poem, somewhat typically for its time, essentially blames frustrated womanhood as if it was her loneliness and inability to find a partner that led to her cursing happy young couples. Well, I tend to find myself unable to find a partner, but I've got to admit I don't exactly go around cursing other people because I do rather have better things to do with me time. So I am a little bit kind of team witch in this particular instance. And I can't help feeling like she might have fallen a little bit foul of some of the gender roles of the time, shall we say. So I think we can possibly take this poem with a little bit of a pinch of salt. But there are also suggestions by Nicholas Reid that Wookey Hole itself actually inspired Coleridge for his Kubla Khan work, which has nothing to do with the story, I just thought it was cool. So is there any actual evidence of a witch at Wookey Hole? Well, some people cite Herbert Balk's discovery in 1912 of an apparent burial site as being definitive evidence, and this particular site was considered to be that of a witch, and I quote, in a layer associated with coins from the very late 4th century, end quote, and that comes from an article Ronald Hutton wrote about it. Other finds from the site included goat bones, which could explain why the goat is in the story, a black bowl, a polished stalagmite ball, a comb and a brooch. And then there was also an iron sickle, human bones and a knife in a pit beneath the site. And while all of these things sound like really exciting proof that the witch actually existed, Ronald Hutton does note that the consensus now is that these finds weren't a single deposit and therefore weren't related to one another. Now, the remains of the witch are on display at the Wells and Mendip Museum in Wells, Somerset, but it is worth noting that according to the Somerset Historic Environment Record, analysis revealed that most of the bones in that site actually belonged to a man between 25 and 35. And have you also spotted a bit of a problem with the story? Yep, it would be pretty difficult to find the witch's bones if she's been turned into a stalagmite elsewhere in the cave. And you can't actually find her in the witch's kitchen cavern. So it's a little bit difficult to have both bones as evidence that she existed and the stalagmite as evidence that she existed. But the thing is, the burial site's also not necessarily that special per se when you take the Wookey Hole cemetery into account. And this was apparently another chamber in the cave system, and people actually found bones from between 20 and 30 people buried there. And it's believed to have been in use for the local Romano-British community. So there's plenty of evidence that people lived in the area between the Iron Age and the Roman occupation of Britain, and it kind of makes sense that you would live in a cave because it's fairly well protected. Obviously you'd be safe from the elements and so on. So finding a burial site in the cave isn't actually that unusual. But then in 2017, staff found witch marks carved into the walls at Wookey Hole while they were creating a caving experience. And these marks have largely been dated between 1550 and 1750, and until the discovery of similar marks at Cresswell Crags in 2019, they were the largest concentration of protective marks in a British cave. Obviously, given the time difference between the age of the skeleton, which is supposed to be around 1,000 years old, and the marks on the walls, it's highly unlikely that they were for the witch found in 1912. So what do we actually make of it all? Well, there's nothing to say that there wasn't a Witch of Wookey Hole, and given the history of people living in the caves, it is entirely possible that there have been people there that some people might have thought were witches, and indeed, witches might have lived in the caves. As I say, there's no evidence to say that there wasn't. But I can't help wondering though if over time stories of people in the caves have then been conflated with tales of stalagmites that look like figures. And it wouldn't be difficult for somebody having also known about the witch marks to then essentially kind of add too many things together and end up with completely the wrong answer. Although, and this is absolutely fantastic, the witch isn't the only legend in Wookey Hole, because there was also a legend of a conger eel around 30 feet long that also lived in the caves, and many centuries ago this eel apparently wanted to be king of the river. He swam up the River Severn, but he ruined the salmon nets and flooded the surrounding countryside. So the furious fishermen drove him back, and they managed to force him into the narrow River Axe that leads off the Severn. And he ended up getting into Wookey Hole, but he couldn't get back out again, and he's apparently still stuck there. Now, I don't know about you, but a 30-foot ancient conger eel is a lot more terrifying than a witch. So it is quite interesting that you've got this legend of this ancient creature stuck in the caves, and yet somehow that one gets massively overshadowed by the witch. So I would be fascinated to know what you think about it. And as I say, there's nothing saying that there was never a witch, but I think it's quite interesting that only one of the variations gives the monk a name. Obviously, so the Abbot of Glastonbury would be a real person. Father Bernard sounds like a real person, but the witch doesn't get a name. And I think that that's unfortunate because it's almost like she then becomes a conglomerate of all of the people who might have lived in the caves at some point. And if you look at English folklore, there are quite a lot of tales of people who society basically left behind, then moving to things like caves and so on to provide shelter. So it wouldn't be impossible for somebody that people just simply didn't want to have around to live in the caves and then to blame for everything that went wrong. It would be entirely possible. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. Next week we are going to meet Mother Redcap in Camden Town in London. So I thought it would be quite fun to have a look at a more urban version. If you are a supporter of the podcast, I think it was a few months ago now, there was one of the short mini episodes about a particular witch who's supposed to have lived in a cave in the woods, who then ended up being claimed by the devil. So if you are interested in these kind of things, there is extra content about witches and so on as part of the Patreon supporting membership, if that is something that your budget stretches to. And it would be lovely to have you as a supporter, and then you can enjoy more content. And speaking of extra content, and also because I mentioned Cresswell Crags earlier, this is how wonderful this little segue is. I'm doing a talk with them on the 24th of June, which the eagle-eyed among you will recognise as Midsummer's Day. And we are looking at Midsummer folklore, so we're going to be looking at things like divination practices that you can do on Midsummer's Day. We will be looking at some solstice stuff as well, which obviously will have been a few days earlier, but I want to kind of look at a lot of the folklore that kind of is gathered around Midsummer in general. So it is free to attend, but obviously any donations do go towards helping with the upkeep of Cresswell Crags, which is obviously a really interesting site in and of itself anyway, and obviously does have that huge concentration of witches' marks as well. So that is, as I say, that is on the 24th of June at 6 p.m. British Summer Time. And the link is in the show notes if you want to grab a ticket, and then they'll send you the Zoom link and all that kind of thing. So it would be lovely to see you there as well if you can make it. But I think that's about it for now. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you've been to Wookey Hole and you've done the tour, please do let me know. If you've actually done any of the cave diving there, again, please do let me know, and you can tell me how utterly terrifying it sounds, because just the idea of being in a cave, just the whole thing about it just terrifies me. That's why I've got such issues with the horror film The Descent, because it's scarier before the monsters come into it. But there we go. So you've now discovered one of my phases. Tight spaces, underground. It's just, no, not for me, thanks. Anyway, I'm rambling now. So I'll see you next week when we go off to meet Mother Redcap in Camden. So until then, have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.